Hello everyone and welcome to week 12. This week we're going to be doing a very brief summary of Black history in America and to some extent how it relates to gender studies. We're going to start in pre-colonial Africa. The material from this week is going to relate to both colonialism and capitalism from last week. So we're often given a very distorted picture in our history of pre-colonial Africa. This was a history that was invented by colonists for their own purpose. We're told that Africa was backward, that people were basically just living as hunter-gatherers, that people, didn't wear clothing really, or didn't have culture or writing or sophistication or buildings or anything. This is not at all true. The history of Africa before Europeans started settling in it and colonizing it is incredibly diverse. We have, of course, cultures like ancient Egypt, which was one of the first really advanced cultures in the world in terms of architecture, in terms of civil society and social programs, sanitation, and so forth. We have the example in the middle here of the Nri culture. This is a culture that made a giant empire just by trading peacefully through contracts, and they built these huge cities that were trading hubs so people would come to them and trade and leave. This is something that's just recently there's been a lot of excavation discovering this and discovering items from all over the world in these very old cities. And then the example here of Ghana, a culture that was, or in Ghana, there was a culture that was very rich, where they had access to gold, and they had a king and a court. And as you can see from the image here, were very much as capable of wearing silly hats as the European kings were. There's, of course, many more examples of different African cultures, but the point I want you to take away here is that Africa was complex, it was diverse, that there were all kinds of different cultures there before Europeans started attacking. So we talked about the system of transatlantic kidnapping known as the slave trade last week. This is obviously crucial for the bringing of African peoples against their will, kidnapping African peoples and bringing them to the Americas. Approximately 10 million people were kidnapped from Africa and taken across the ocean. Something like 10%, 20% of those died in crossing. So something like a million, 2 million people died during the crossing. This was very much a business triangle. So the boats came from Europe, in particular from the UK, from England, and they came to the African coast where they would buy people who had been enslaved. They would then take those people to the Americas, where they would sell them to plantations. They would then pick up the materials from those plantations, and at first they would take the raw materials back to Europe, and then later they would take the raw materials to industrial centers in the Americas, such as in New York and so forth, where those materials would be processed into goods that would then be taken back to Europe and sold. So while it was the case that the vast majority of slavery took place in the Americas during this time, as you can see here, only 0.3 million of the people were taken directly to Europe. It's still very much the case that Europe, and also in the case of the US, the northern states, the states that ostensibly didn't have slavery, were very much involved in the financial and business pattern that made slavery profitable, that made it necessary. So while the UK, for example, abolished slavery quite early, it was still the case that they were buying and selling goods that were the result of slavery, thereby creating the demand, thereby making it profitable. It's also true that Africans were involved in slavery. Specifically, the majority of the people who were captured by Africans and then brought to ports on the coast where Europeans could pick them up. There had been slavery in Africa before to some extent, but the existence of a market created by Europeans exploded the demand for slavery, and so people in Africa made this their full-time occupation, where they would capture people in order to sell them. And we'll talk about this more later, but it's important to know that during this time there was significant resistance. People didn't just put up with it. People didn't just accept it. They fought back in all kinds of ways, including capturing boats, including committing, in some cases, mass suicide as a protest off the boats, mentioned powerfully in the end of Black Panther by Killmonger. So slavery has existed through human history in all kinds of ways. What we're talking about when we talk about slavery in the Americas, and specifically in the US, is a very specific type of slavery that's different in some important ways from those other times that it's been practiced. And the technical term we use sometimes for this is chattel slavery. So what were some of the characteristics of this? First of all, it was generational. That meant that you could be born, or you were born, into a condition of slavery. So if someone was enslaved, then their children would be owned by the person who enslaved them. And related to this, of course, it was racial. Now, we talk a lot about racial disparities in the US in the prison system, for example. You watch 13th. But in the case of slavery, that's not what we're saying. It's not the case that the majority of enslaved people were black people. It's in fact that it was only legal to enslave people of African descent. Slavery was illegal in the US from the beginning for white people. And this comes out of an important case in 1640, so long before the United States got its independence. And this involved John Punch. He was a man of African descent, and he was in a condition of what we would call indentured servitude. So he had a contract to work that he was working, he wasn't getting paid, and he was working alongside some people of European descent. And John Punch and two of his buddies, also Europeans who were also in indentured servitude, decided to escape. And they escaped together, and unfortunately they were captured together, and they were taken to court. And the person who had the contracts on them demanded, as punishment for them trying to escape, that they be made permanently in his servitude. So converted from servants, indentured servants, into slaves. And what the court ruled is that this wasn't allowed for the Europeans, the two Europeans who had escaped alongside him, that it wasn't legal to have a permanent, lifelong ownership of a European. However, it was legal for John Punch, the man of African descent, and that made him the first legally recognized by the state enslaved person in the US. It was also very much a capitalist enterprise. This was something that was incredibly profitable. The reason that it was done in such large numbers is that people were making a lot of money off of it. Going back to it being racial, this is an important difference from other types of chattel slavery, or other types of slavery, around the world, is that in most cases historically, the people that were being enslaved were the same in terms of how they looked to the people who were doing the slaving, right? So when slavery was practiced in Africa before colonialism, it was Africans enslaving their neighbors, and so they didn't distinguish as being a different type of person, right? The reason they were enslaved is often they had lost a battle or something, right? But it wasn't something that was inherent to their racial makeup in the way that chattel slavery began to be understood. It was a system of labor. That means that people were working. As we talked about in the discussion of capitalism, people doing work creates value, right? So what the enslaved people were largely doing is, in many cases, working the land, right? So they were taking land that had a certain value to begin with, and then they were increasing that value by doing work to it. And so wealth was being created, right? They were, in essence, creating surplus labor, but then, of course, they weren't getting paid for that. The people who enslaved them were getting paid for that. And so the result was, in essence, a absolute version of capitalism where 100% of the surplus labor was captured by the capitalist owner. It was also a system of sexual labor. We don't typically talk about this, and it's a painful thing, but slavery, especially of women of African descent, was organized rape. Rape was incredibly widespread across slavery. Women were sold as being appropriate for having sex with, right? They were sold on their sexual characteristics in the slave marketplace. And it was entirely legal to rape enslaved people. They were also made to do sexual labor in terms of having children. As you probably know, the slave trade was made illegal long before slavery was made illegal. So it was illegal to bring new people into the country, but it was still legal to hold slaves. And so, of course, the way that people who had enslaved people wanted to increase the value was to have more people. So the people were forced to have children. They were forced to have sex with each other against their will in order to produce children that the owners thought would be, valuable. They would select enslaved people and tell them that they had to get pregnant or they would be punished, right? And this really established a power relationship in terms of sex and sexuality around race in America, where the two of them are very deeply tied together from the beginning of this country. It also involved the destruction of families. The enslaved people were not legally allowed to get married. They often formed long-term relationships, of course, as people do, and fell in love and created families together. But those families were always on the condition of the person who had enslaved them allowing them to continue. And in fact, they often destroyed families, took away children, split up people who were together, took away people's siblings and so forth, sold them to other places, sometimes just in the course of business, thoughtless cruelty, sometimes as a punishment, as a way to keep people in line. Of course, this is a very powerful threat for parents, the possibility of their children being taken away from them. In addition, we had talked about patrilineality, right, and the way that in a patriarchal society, wealth, power, ancestry, reputation is passed down through the male line. The thing that the kidnapping of people from Africa and bringing them to America did was to break those ancestral chains, to break those family passing downs, whether that was done matrilineally or patrilineally, in a way that destroyed, obviously, people's wealth, but also their culture, their traditions, their sense of belonging and ancestry. And that was done very much intentionally. People were mixed up, so they weren't close to people that had been kidnapped from the same area as them, so they wouldn't know the same languages and so forth. And people were punished for using their names given them to by their parents in Africa. They were punished for practicing their traditional spiritual or cultural or artistic practices, and instead forced to engage in ones that were recognized as valuable by Europeans. Of course, I hope you all know about the violence and terror that was done under slavery. We talk about that probably more than some of the other aspects. People were mutilated, feet were cut off, teeth were pulled out, people were whipped and beaten, and so forth. But I think in some ways when we talk about that, we miss the systematic nature of it. That even in the cases where that wasn't done, right, even in the case of the slave owners who used relatively little physical violence, it was still the case that was always present as a force, right, always a possibility. And again, importantly, it was legal. It was legal to kill people who were enslaved. It was legal to do anything to them. And the threat of that, the knowledge that someone had that power over you, is a terrible thing, whether or not they actually use it. The last thing I want to talk about is involvement of white people by class, meaning economic class. So in order to own a working plantation, that was a lot of land. Land is expensive. Enslaved people were expensive to purchase the rights to own them. And so it was relatively few white people who did this. It was basically the super rich who had large plantations, who were able to own large numbers of enslaved people and make profit from them. However, despite the fact that it was relatively small people at the top who were really making the wealth off of this, white people were involved across the social spectrum. They were employed on plantations as overseers, in all kinds of roles. They were, in some cases, they would own or just perhaps lease a single enslaved person, or perhaps they would just have an enslaved person who worked for them for part of the year as a harvest that they would lease off a local plantation owner. Right? It was also the case that some free people of African descent actually owned other people of African descent who were enslaved in the South, because this was also to some extent an economic system. But overwhelmingly, despite the fact that many white people in the South during this time were poor and had very little power, they always had more power than enslaved people, and that always gave them a elevated position in society, no matter their economic position. The question I want to ask now is whether people at the time knew that enslavement was wrong. We know that morality changes through history, it changes across culture, and in some cases it would be unfair to look back at people from the past and the decisions they made and condemn them using contemporary modern morality, since things had developed and they didn't necessarily know or believe that something that we know now is wrong was wrong at the time. In the case of slavery, that's not true. People at the time absolutely did know that it was wrong. And I have a couple of arguments for this. First of all, as I said, slavery was illegal for white people. It was illegal to enslave white people. White people certainly knew that they didn't want to be enslaved, that it would be wrong if it happened to them, and they created legal systems to protect them. Also, we know that there was a huge amount of discussion about this, right? There were arguments, there were newspaper articles written on both sides where people, were saying that it was wrong, that it should be abolished, that people were defending it in various ways. And this goes right back to the Constitution, right, to the Declaration of Independence. In fact, originally a condemnation of slavery was going to be included in the Declaration of Independence. It was going to be one of the things that King George III was seen as responsible for. However, it was removed in order to make the slave-owning states feel comfortable signing on to the Declaration. And similarly, in the Constitution, there's a number of references. They never quite used the word because they were embarrassed by it. They knew that it was wrong. But there's a number of references to it. Most famously is the 3/5 clause, in which they counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person in terms of apportioning the vote, deciding how many representatives each state should get. And that was an argument between people that believed that enslaved people shouldn't count at all and people that believed that they should count fully. And the argument is perhaps the other way round than you might think. It was the people from the free states in the north who thought that enslaved people should count as 0 because they didn't want the southern states to have the power of those additional population that would in turn give them more representatives, whilst the slave states wanted enslaved people to count as a full person because that would give them more representation, and they reached this compromise of 3/5. But the point is, in order to have that argument, you have to know whether or not you think slavery is wrong or not, right? You have to be aware that at least some people think that it's wrong. So certainly that knowledge was out there, that morality existed. So given that, what arguments did they use to justify it? There was in fact a huge industry of writers, of thinkers, of people who made arguments justifying slavery. So there was a huge effort to justify slavery, and these ideas that we used to justify it became and are still incredibly important in the way that America is constituted as a country, in the way that Americans think about themselves. So it's important to look at these in some depth. The first one is dehumanization, of treating people of African descent as less human, as thinking them as less human. They were often depicted as being closer to apes, closer to animals, as a different species than white people. That's, of course, not true. In the sense of evolution, people argued that white people were somehow more evolved, were higher up the evolutionary tree than people of African descent were. Also scientifically rubbish. And talking of science, there was a huge scientific effort here. There were many scientists who wrote about the differences between white people and black people in ways that portrayed black people as genetically, as physically and mentally inferior, and argued that this was scientifically true. This brings us to the paradox of racial purity. What do I mean by this? So, one of the problems with this argument that black people are somehow different in terms of being a different species or something is, of course, black people and white people can have babies and do have babies, and those babies are also fully people, right? We don't see that with, that's one of the definitions of species, right? Different species can't have fertile children together, but of course people of all races can have children, and so we know that all humans are species from that. And in fact, the fact that people have children together really breaks down this idea that there is something fundamentally different about white people and black people, right? And so in order to maintain this idea, white people who believed that they were superior had to maintain their racial purity, had to argue that there was something about whiteness that was corrupted, and we'll talk about this more later, that was in danger from marriage, from having children with people of color. And so did all kinds of things like making marriage between races illegal, like killing people for having sexual relations with people of different races and so forth, in order to protect that racial purity. But that's always a losing game, right? The nature of humans is that they will fall in love, that they will have children together. And so those attempts to keep racial purity were always doomed to fail and have continued to fail. There was also this idea that black people were culturally inferior, and this one has really stuck with us, the idea that black people are lazier. Now, this is a particularly, I mean, in some ways, almost hilariously ridiculous idea, right? Because here we had these white plantation owners who were forcing other people to do their work for them, and then were turning around and calling the people who they forced to do the work lazy. And I mean, one of the kind of basic ideas of capitalism is that you're motivated to work by an income, right? That if you don't pay people, they won't work. Well, obviously, people who were enslaved were well aware that the work that they were doing was not benefiting them. It was benefiting someone else. And so in some cases, they may have been reluctant to do as enthusiastic a job as someone might do if they were working for their own profit. But this was treated as something that was a problem with African people, that was like kind of part of their psychology, that they just didn't work hard. And so they needed to be forced to work hard. There was also the idea that, I talked about this in the context of colonialism, that people from the global south, from Africa, were more like children. They weren't able to look after themselves. They weren't able to have civilization in the way that European people could. You know, they didn't use knives and forks at the tables. They didn't wear suits, whatever the like markers of civilization were. And the idea was that they were just less successful as being people. They were more like children and they needed guidance. And so the white people put themselves in this position of parent, of the father, the pater, right, which is where paternalism comes from. And so they argued that, well, we're really doing them a favor, that, look, we're providing them with housing and work, and we're providing them with, healthcare and food and so forth. And so it's really kind of us, it's a duty that we have as white slavers to provide these things for these poor African people who can't take care of themselves. Right? And again, that attitude of paternalism is very much still part of the way that we think about people of color in the US today often. And this was all tied up in Christianity, in the idea that Christianity is so wonderful and so much superior to whatever practices that people had in Africa, that it was really doing them a favor to provide them with access to Christ. And there's a certain logic here, right? If you believe, as some Christians do, that only by being a Christian can you get into heaven, and that people who aren't a Christian are going to go to eternal damnation, right? Then the argument is the benefit to someone of saving their soul is so huge that it dwarfs anything that happens to them in life. So again, the fact that Africans were brought to America and introduced to Christianity was doing them such a huge favor that they should be grateful and put up with anything else that was done to them. Now, there's several reasons why this is ridiculous. First of all, you do not have to enslave people to introduce them to Christianity. It's also not true that Africans didn't have access to Christianity. Christianity actually came to Africa far, far before European colonialism did, largely through traders across the Middle East, right? Africa is right next to the Middle East, where Christianity developed. It's as close to, Ghana is as close to Israel, what is now Israel-Palestine, as the UK is, right? And so traders traveled with their religions between the areas, and Christianity is ancient in Africa. So they didn't actually need introduction at all. But on top of it, that's hardly justification, and we might hope goes in contrast with conflict with some of the values of Christianity, perhaps. There was also the happy slave myth, the idea that people were happy to be working, were singing in the fields, right? If you're familiar with minstrelsy or something like Disney's movie The Song of the South, right? This is part of this myth, this idea of the jovial kind of person of African descent in America who's really enjoying their condition. Another thing we see is people justifying it to themselves and being in denial of their involvement of it. Probably the strongest example of this in US history is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a man who had very strong beliefs in the rights of people to be free. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, one of the most powerful documents in human history on this topic. And he was also a man who enslaved other human beings. And so how does someone deal with that kind of mental conflict? Well, the answer is they justify it to themselves. So if you look at what Jefferson said, he said things like, well, first of all, he treated his enslaved people better than other people did, right? So he would say, it's okay for me to have slaves because, well, I'm nice to them compared to other. Well, in some ways that wasn't true. They just made it the job of the overseers to do the punishment. Also, it's not actually important whether you are nice to someone. The fact that you have them in a condition of slavery is so horrific that the actual kind of treatment within that is not important. He also argues that, well, they wouldn't have anywhere else to go, right? That if you freed them, well, what would they do? Like, maybe it was bad that we brought them here in the first place, but given that they're here, this is the only thing that they can do. It's kind of doing them a favor to keep them here. There were actually some efforts to provide the possibility of people returning to Africa. We talked briefly about Liberia. Marcus Garvey and the African liners are part of that history. It's a fascinating history. And then there was the argument that, well, it was just economically necessary, right? That a plantation owner might say, well, I don't believe in slavery. I would like to free the people I have enslaved. But the market is such that other people, other plantation owners are going to be using enslaved labor. And obviously I can't compete in the marketplace if I don't do so, right? This brings us back to capitalism and the pressure of the the marketplace, that it's not that it's because people are unusually cruel that they um, treat their workers badly, or in the ultimate case of slavery, treat them as don't pay them at all. It's that the market demands it, because if you don't do it, someone else will. It's rewarded by the system, so someone will follow those rewards, right? These are just some examples of how people justified it themselves even when they knew it was wrong. There was also an incredible fear of resistance. In many places in the slave states, enslaved people outnumbered free people quite substantially. They certainly outnumbered the owners of enslaved people. And people were well aware that they didn't like it, even though they pretended that they did. They were also well aware that people didn't like being enslaved, and they were terrified of slave uprisings, justifiably so in some cases. And so they instituted militias. In some ways, the beginnings of the police force were in the US were to catch and keep enslaved people. They enlisted slave catchers to catch people who had escaped from slavery, including riding north and catching people. And just in general, were in fear. Again, this is evidence that they were well aware that what they were doing was wrong, because they knew that the people they were doing it to were unhappy about it and were possibly going to rise up against them. The other half of the ideology of slavery is about whiteness, is about treating whiteness as being better and making connections, solidarity, identity between white people of different economic classes, of different situations, of telling poor white people that, well, at least they're white, right? That they should be proud to be white, to be better than black people. And this creates unity across social classes, and again, literally employing some white people to do the work of enforcing slavery, right? The job of whipping someone, for example, that wasn't something that typically a rich owner would do. That was something they would employ a working class white person to do, right? And then finally, just the term slave. I try and avoid using it. I try and never refer to a person as a slave, but rather a person who is enslaved. But it is very common that we refer to people as slaves. We'll say, he was a slave, like Frederick Douglass was born a slave or something, right? But no person is a slave. These are all just people that a crime was done to them, right? So I recommend we kind of shift the focus to the people who were doing the enslaving, right? What we had here is slavers, who were people who were committing a crime, and then human beings that this was done to. And the fact that this was done to them doesn't make them slaves. It just makes them people who were who had a crime done to them. You're familiar with this story by now, but wherever there is power, wherever people are oppressed, people have agency. They resist in different ways. And we see a wide variety of ways that people resisted. Of course, there was a continuous stream of people escaping successfully or unsuccessfully from slavery. That was an important form of resistance. People who took their own lives as a way of resisting, of protesting, large numbers of people. People who would kill their children. If you've read the Toni Morrison book Beloved, that's about this topic. And again, we can have no doubt of how terrible slavery was, that people were able to kill their own children in order to spare them from the life that faced them. Refusal to work stoppages, sabotaging machinery. I talked about how there were attempts to destroy people's culture. Well, there was also resistance to that. People maintained traditional spiritual religious practices. They maintained traditional artistic practices. And it's because of those that we have these incredible syncretic cultures that are defining of American culture. The blues, jazz, syncretic religions like Voodoo, Santeria, and so forth. Right? People also engaged in mockery of people who enslaved them. They resisted individually with violence by hitting back, right? Frederick Douglass did this, for example. They organized the most successful organized, what they were called at the time was slave revolts, was organized by Nat Turner, an interesting person who learned to read from the Bible, was a preacher, and decided to organize a group of people to fight back against slavery. He rescued a large number of people, killed the plantation owners, including their children and families, quite brutally, but freed large numbers of people before eventually a militia was formed to destroy him. Haiti is the first country to successfully have a revolution where enslaved people threw off the people who enslaved them. In that case, it was France. There was also an intellectual tradition that arose from this, where people thought about and wrote about and considered the life of an enslaved person and how they felt about it and how they wanted to respond to it. And that's the basis of, again, these amazing literary and musical traditions in the US, as well as philosophical traditions. Again, I already mentioned Frederick Douglass, but is a giant here. And then I talked a little about the movement back to Africa that was organized in part by kind of more wealthy, middle-class black people in the North who were trying to help out escaped enslaved people. So I've mentioned Christianity a couple of times. Let's talk about that. Christianity was mobilized on both sides of the argument. The white people, this is, who were for and against slavery were almost entirely Christians, because almost everyone who was white in the US at that time was a Christian. And so the people who were arguing that slavery was wrong were arguing often from the morality of the Bible. The people who were arguing slavery was right were also using the Bible, and both of them found plenty in Scripture, plenty in the ideas of Christianity to justify their response. And let me be clear here that the Christians that were in favor of slavery were very sincere. They believed deeply that they were good Christians who were doing the right thing, who were following the Bible in this way. I already mentioned that Christianity existed in Africa long before Europeans came. I talked about how Christianity was used to justify slavery, the idea that, well, at least, enslaved people were getting access to Christianity, and this was such a wonderful thing. Well, what that meant is that while a lot of the basic rights of humans were taken away from enslaved African peoples in the US, for example, it was illegal for them to gather, it was illegal for them to read, it was illegal for them to get educated, it was illegal for them to speak publicly, right? All of these sorts of things. However, it was very hard for them to justify keeping people away from Christianity. And so as a result, the one place that enslaved people were allowed to gather in groups was in Christian worship. The one thing they were allowed to read, in very few cases, but ever, was the Bible, or books that they had access to at all, right? This is what happened with Nat Turner. Is he was unusually brilliant at a very young age, and the woman who enslaved him, the wife of the plantation owner, noticed him in her library looking at books. And she said, well, he's, so brilliant, we have to at least give him the Bible, right? So he was given a copy of the Bible and allowed to teach himself to read from that. The Bible has one story depicted here that is a very important story in the Old Testament that is all about slavery, right? This is the story of Moses, who leads the Israelites, the enslaved Jewish people, out of slavery in Egypt. And the Bible is very clear on which side God is on here, right? God sends, in collaboration with Moses, the 10 plagues to attack the Egyptians who are enslaving the Israelites. These plagues are horrific. They include the killing of the firstborn son in the Passover of all of the families. So this story, straight from the Bible, is very illustrative of the idea that, first of all, that enslaved people can get free, that they can lead themselves, right? That members of their group can lead them to freedom, and also that when they do that, God will be on their side, and also that God is willing to use violence against the slavers. And so enslaved preachers, people were able to tell this story, right? And it was a lot harder for the plantation owners, for the slave owners, to punish them for it, because hey, they were just reading from the Bible, they were just telling a Bible story, but they all knew what it was about. I've already talked about syncretic religion, the use of Christian elements combining with other traditional West African elements to create new. This brings us to the Dred Scott case, Dred Scott versus Stanford, involving Dred and Harriet Scott. I'm going to simplify this case because, again, this is not a law class, but if you look it up, you'll see the details are a little more complicated than this. But broadly, Dred Scott and Harriet Scott were enslaved people. They were brought by the person who owned them at the time north to Illinois. Illinois was a free state at the time. They were then taken to Wisconsin, which was a free territory. And Dred Scott was an educated man. He worked as a kind of clerk, so he did like administrative tasks for the guy who had enslaved him. So he took him to these free states, and while they were there, they got legally married. Remember, it was illegal for people of African descent, or enslaved people, to get married in the slave states, but they were legally allowed to in Wisconsin at the time. They had a child, and they returned then to Missouri. And Dred and Harriet said, well, we would like to be free now, having lived most of our lives in slavery. And they had saved up some money. They were earning money while they were employed in these free states, attempted to buy their freedom, but their owner refused. And so they went to court and sued for their freedom under Missouri law. Now, there was a common law at the time in most of the states that said if you had ever been free, then you were always free. If you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, where a free person of African descent in the North was kidnapped by slave catchers and brought to the South, a man who had never been enslaved but was kidnapped as an adult from New York, I believe. That's one of the reasons these laws existed. So the idea was that if you could show that you had been free at some point in your life, then you had to be always free. So this was the grounds on which they went to court. And the Supreme Court made this really radical decision. You know, they could have just said, oh, no, Dred and Harriet Scott have to stay enslaved. But what they actually said was that Dred Scott didn't have the right to come to court in the first place because he was not a person under the law, meaning he was not a legal entity. He didn't have any rights, including the most basic right to sue for wrong done to him in this case. And they argued that people of African descent in the US had no rights, weren't really people legally. This is widely regarded as the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. It led directly to the Civil War. And I just want to read you from the decision here. The justices said, no one of that race, meaning people of African descent, had ever migrated to the United States voluntarily. All of them had been brought here as articles of merchandise. So two things there. Firstly, the first statement is not true. There were, in fact, black people who came to the United States voluntarily. There were black people in Europe going back forever, right? Black people exist all over the world. And so, you know, English black people, for example, had traveled to the US just like English white people had. Similarly, some people from Africa had migrated to the US voluntarily. So while it's true that the vast majority of African Americans were brought to the US, kidnapped and brought here enslaved, it's certainly not true that was the case for all of them. Also note here, referring to them as articles of merchandise, again back to capitalism, right? This is what we mean by chattel slavery. They're being treated as something that someone owns for their business, for making profit, not as a human being. Okay, next statement. It is obvious that they were not even in the minds of the framers of the Constitution when they were conferring special rights and privileges upon the citizens. Again, that's false. We know that the framers argued about this topic, and certainly they thought about it while they were writing the Constitution. Finally, indeed, when we look upon the condition of this race in the several states meaning the states where slavery is legal at the time, it is impossible to believe that these rights and privileges were intended to be extended to them. This leads to the American Civil War. I'm not going to say much about this, except it is about slavery. It became fashionable to say that, the war was really about states' rights or something, but it was about the states' rights to maintain slavery. It was absolutely entirely about slavery. And if you read the declarations that the southern states made when they formed the Confederacy, they are very clear that this is what they're going to war about. The second thing you should know is that Harriet Tubman is a stone-cold badass American hero, and I will recommend to you a video that you can watch now after this on that topic. And then finally, the North wins.